In this news roundup of the week for Friday, October 31st, 2025, President Trump sows confusion and alarm around the world by ordering a return to nuclear testing, which provokes a chilling response from Russia. The Netherlands signals a possible pushback to the populist right wave that's been sweeping across Europe, with a return to the centre in its latest election. And high-profile populist right influencers are starting to take up the Trump administration's invitation to claim refugee status in America to escape the free speech hellholes they otherwise live in. Also, some updates on stories from earlier in the week, and I reply to a couple of questions. So, let's jump straight in. In addition to losing a trade war this week, President Trump potentially added fuel to the next Cold War, with a somewhat puzzling announcement that he wants America to resume testing nuclear weapons. And he wanted to do this, he said in a social media post, because of other countries testing nuclear weapons, meaning he had instructed the Department of War to start nuclear testing on an equal basis with all of those. Which sounds a bit like when he introduced a raft of reciprocal tariffs that was based on a formula that had nothing to do with what other people were tariffing the United States. And so it was this time. As Matthew Bunn of Harvard University told CNN, every statement in that post is wrong. It's hardly the first time, let's face it. It's not true that other states are carrying out nuclear tests. Trump seems to think it's the Department of Defense that carries out nuclear tests. It's not. It's the Department of Energy. It could be that Trump is simply confused by Russia's testing of a nuclear-powered missile. The point, of course, being that it's nuclear propulsion for the missile. It enables it to fly for a very long time. Has nothing to do with what warhead it may or may not have. And the recent testing of this missile that Putin made sure to announce to the world did not include any sort of testing a nuclear warhead as part of it. So it could be that if it was explained slowly to him in words of 2 syllables or less, Trump would come to agree that yes, that's the sort of testing he meant, not actually the whole exploding nuclear bombs thing. If Trump decided that no, he really wanted to resume making big bang bang, to use a technical term, then as well as blowing a hole under the desert, he would be blowing an equally large hole in the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Traditional logic had been that the United States, having extensively already tested its systems in the past, had an advantage over other states from the signing of that treaty, especially over any newcomers to the nuclear club. Russia last tested a nuclear bomb in 1990, China in 1996. The main exception to this was international pariah North Korea, and even they last tested in 2017. But it seems there is no historical advantage so straightforward that President Trump won't want to tear it up for fear that it was created by the far-left liberal elites, or something. Vice President J.D. Vance quickly jumped in to try to give a more rational-sounding argument, telling reporters yesterday that it was important to test to make sure the nuclear arsenal actually functions properly. Then he must have thought about the implications of that for a few seconds, because he added, "To be clear, we know that it does work properly, but you gotta keep on top of it." He did not add that you also had to factor in the apparent fact that the President of the United States is a blithering idiot who doesn't know what he's talking about. But he probably should have. Experts in the field expect that fresh nuclear bomb tests would give little new useful information to the United States. It might benefit China the most, since it would doubtless quickly follow suit if America unilaterally broke the moratorium, and it has a lot of new nuclear weapons that it would like to test. It will likely benefit other countries who are newly ambitious to develop their own nukes in the light of America becoming an unreliable ally and the world a less stable place. Russia will certainly embrace the moment. Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov said this: "All countries are developing their defense systems, but this is not a nuclear test. If someone abandons the moratorium, Russia will act accordingly. Peskov was also responding to reports in the Financial Times this week that it had been an uncompromising memo from Moscow that sank the proposed summit between Presidents Putin and Trump in Budapest. The FT said that the memo came before the tense call between Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov that scuppered the planned summit. And basically the memo had made it clear Russia had no intention of giving an inch in its maximalist demands over what Putin insists are the root causes of the invasion, meaning that he would have come to a second summit with Trump determinedly unwilling to negotiate, a position that left Trump unimpressed. Well, Moscow is not happy about this news being shared in the Financial Times, and Peskov said in response that one should trust only official statements of the Russian Foreign Ministry and the US State Department, because of course he did, and quite right too. I only ever buy my bridges from those two esteemed outlets with their impeccable credentials. Meanwhile, in the world of real actions and real consequences, we are at least seeing that Trump's recent move of putting sanctions onto the top two Russian oil companies is beginning to have some impact. This took the form of one of those two companies, Lukoil, announcing that it is selling most of its international assets to Swiss commodity trader Gunvor as a result of the sanctions. Now, some commentators on YouTube and other places have been reporting this as Lukoil collapsing. That's not really what's happening. It is continuing its Russian-based business, selling Russian oil to those that are still buying it, which almost certainly includes the likes of China and Turkey and others, maybe still India, up in the air at the moment. But Lukoil's operations outside of Russia, which includes refineries in Europe, petrol station networks in the US and Europe, gas and oil production in Iraq and the UAE, those operations would not be able to continue at all unless their ownership was passed from the sanctioned entity. The total value of those international assets, estimated at around $12 billion, likely to be sold at a pretty steep discount under the circumstances. It's indicative that there are early consequences to be felt, but the real factor is going to be how many of the major buyers of Russian oil decide to source from elsewhere. And that is the key factor, and the pressure is particularly on European countries with MAGA populists in charge, such as Hungary, where Viktor Orban has been trying to defend his country's access to Russia's oil, because he's a big mate of Vladimir Putin's, as well as a fan of cheap oil. But of course he's also Trump's best authoritarian buddy in Europe, so the pressure is seriously on. Poor lamb. And speaking of the best known of the Euro wave of MAGA populism, for those concerned that that phenomenon is sweeping relentlessly across Europe, the next story may give some signs of hope. Because the Netherlands had its most recent election this week. We had seen in the last year a fragile coalition that included Geert Wilder's far-right Party for Freedom, the PVV. That was in power, but the coalition collapsed. Specifically, it collapsed after about a year because Wilders exited the coalition over immigration policy. So that sent voters into another election, and this election was predicted to be likely to create a pushback towards the centre. How strong a push? Not entirely clear. Wilder's party was likely still to be the largest, but now none of the mainstream parties were saying they were prepared to go into coalition with him. So that pointed towards a centrist government. Well, in the event, he went even further than that, because the centrist Liberal D66 party, which had been polling in third place before the election, performed more strongly than expected, and just pipped the PVV into the lead position. Both parties got 26 seats each, but D66 led the PVV by 15,000 votes, with 99.7% of the votes counted. This represented an addition of 17 seats for D66 and a loss of 11 seats for the PVV. It's a pretty significant shift. Also, the other parties that had been in the right-wing coalition with the PVV lost support, with one of them, the NSC, losing all 20 of its elected representatives, a total wipeout. So this is enough to give D66 the leader status, which means that its leader, Rob Jetton, will be invited to put together a governing coalition. The country has been tempted by the populist promise, and having sampled what it had to offer, is now going back towards the mainstream. Doesn't make the next part simple, of course. Creating a stable coalition from parties that were recently enthusiastically tearing lumps out of each other is kind of the downside of proportional voting systems. But this is the chance for those parties to show the alternative to the populists. As Jetton himself said, "I think voters have made it clear that working together in the centre is really the message behind this result." The previous coalition, the most right-wing in Dutch history, had been rated by voters as one of the least effective of recent times. It was rated as having been hobbled by inexperience, with 3 out of the 4 parties never having governed before, instability, and deep internal divisions, which you might recognise are all factors that are reliably to be found in many of the MAGA-style populist movements coming to the fore in different European countries. In the Dutch case, the proportional system and the coalition governments that necessarily result protected the country somewhat from wholesale radical dismantling of its democratic institutions. So it's been an experiment quickly recovered from, providing the mainstream politicians get their act together, which you can never take for granted. You might ask, why did the D66 overperform right at the end? One of the stories being told about it is that it ran a positive, solutions-focused campaign, ignoring the negativity of the last couple of years and focusing particularly on solving the housing crisis with an ambitious plan to build 10 new cities. There may be something to take note of there. Now, maybe that bad news for European populists also led to the next story, because Naomi Seidt, the young German AfD activist, dubbed the anti-Greta back in 2020 for her climate skeptic campaigning, she has reportedly filed for political asylum in the United States. Seidt says that returning to Germany would expose her to imprisonment or physical harm due to Antifa death threats and the claimed lack of freedom of speech. She has remained a high-profile figure for the AfD through her interactions online with Elon Musk. Musk has retweeted her posts around 40 times, and Seidt says that he has privately messaged her about the situation in Germany and the AfD. And indeed, those private conversations enabled her to give a nugget of insight into Elon Musk, not previously widely known, because she said this: "Elon has been terrified to go to Europe and knows that there is an extremely high threat, and has confirmed this to me personally. That's when I made the decision to apply for asylum myself. He gave me his approval for that." The move comes after the Trump administration had shifted its policy on refugee and asylum status, seeking to prioritise those facing persecution on grounds of political speech. And that change meant that Europeans who play into the MAGA view of free speech failings could be eligible. Seidt's submission puts her at the head of the pack in taking advantage of that change from that particular perspective. Now, the fact she has Elon Musk as a prominent backer, now that he seems to be sort of back in the MAGA fold to some extent, that might also help to expedite the decision. Is this the start of a movement of right-wing influencers deserting their countries for the paradise that is Trump's America? We will have to wait and see. When British podcaster and musician Winston Marshall was given a chance to ask a question at the White House press briefing a few months ago, because of course he was, he took the opportunity to disparage his own country and to ask then whether people would be able to claim asylum from Britain anytime soon. It was greeted with a smirk and seen as a great joke, which was how it was probably intended, but that is now literally what's being put in place. Will Marshall be next in the queue, Or will he just carry on doing his videos claiming that Britain is on the brink of civil war, knowing that he actually does have free speech and he can say whatever he likes? We watch with slightly less than bated breath. Now, earlier this week, I covered the piece by Bill Gates, where he was arguing that while climate change mitigation was happening and needed to continue happening, human well-being should become much more of a focus of climate action going forward. In that piece, I covered the criticism that some were making of his article because the way that he'd framed it as a big pivot against doomerism, which was only ever a minority fringe anyway, it kind of made it easy for his words to be misrepresented by the MAGA anti-net zero crowd. And boy, did they prove that critic right. President Trump himself led the misrepresentation with this remarkable contribution. We just won the war on the climate change hoax. Bill Gates has finally admitted that he was completely wrong on the issue. It took courage to do so, and for that we are all grateful. MAGA. Various other MAGA and climate skeptic influencers took to Twitter, needless to say, to layer on even more levels of stating that the hoax had finally been revealed, blah 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 blah. It may be news to everyone else that the whole underpinning of climate science was what Bill Gates does or doesn't think about it, even if he now said that he believed it was a hoax, which of course isn't remotely what he actually said. You'd have to ask, does it matter? Answer being, not really. All those MAGA types were professing total certainty in their assertion that it was all a hoax before. They were quoting bogus statistics, fringe voices, outright lies in order to do so. So adding to that arsenal some additional outright lies about what Bill Gates did or didn't say, well, it's pretty much par for the course. Resign yourself to hearing all about how Bill Gates exposed the so-called climate scam for years and years to come. And meanwhile, the planet will continue to warm up. What a weird, unexplainable coincidence that will be. Now, yesterday I covered Trump's summit with China's Xi Jinping. Today, the APEC summit in South Korea continued, but with Trump having exited, Xi Jinping had free rein to dominate proceedings and to lobby the leaders present. His key messages: that China, of course, was a champion of open, reliable trade on World Trade Organization principles, unlike some that he didn't specifically mention. And also he had de facto warned the attendees not to pick sides by joining the United States in seeking to damage China's role in key supply chains. Again, not by specifically mentioning them. In addition to those messages, Xi also met with Canada's Mark Carney, who agreed with him a visit to China in the near future. Carney, of course, is quietly working at the summit to make good on his stated goal of doubling non-US trade for Canada in the next 10 years. President Xi also met with Japan's new leader, Sanae Takaichi, whose positioning vis-à-vis China has been more provocative to date. Takaichi told reporters that she'd raised Japan's concerns about China's flexing on rare earths. She also criticised China's militarization of the South China Sea and human rights abuses in Hong Kong and the Xinjiang region. It underlined that the rare earths flexing was rather the own goal for China in some ways in this company, in this group of countries. The rare earth restrictions may have been provoked by Trump's theatrics, but it was used as leverage against everyone, including the countries that Xi Jinping is now saying should embrace China as the reliable partner. It's hard to completely get away with being the voice of reason and stability when the threat of a resumption of those restrictions is now going to be constantly hanging in the air. America's Scott Bessent was quick to jump on this. Bessent stayed behind in the summit after Trump left. He predicted, some would say rather optimistically, that it would only take the United States 12 to 24 months to remove their dependency from China on rare earth minerals. And he said this: "China has alerted everyone to the danger. They've made a real mistake. It's one thing to put the gun on the table, it's another thing to fire shots in the air." Which is a comment that would be a valid critique coming from just about anybody other than the Trump administration, which has kind of turned randomly shooting into the air as something of an art form. Alright, time to respond to a couple of your questions quickly. Arlene Kirby 4828 said this: "Thanks, Mallen, for well-researched commentary. I subscribe to several Ukrainian YouTube channels which I know are biased, but they seem to indicate Russia is about to collapse. This doesn't seem to be reported in the mainstream media. Channels like PPR Global, Times Radio, etc. report that any moment Russia fail. Can you tell us what the reality is?" Well, look, they're all speculating, and all I could do would be to add speculation of my own. Generally speaking, though, you will find channels that, as you say, will always make the same prediction. So pro-Ukraine channels may always be saying Russia's about to collapse. Pro-Russia channels, of course, are saying the opposite. There are other channels predicting China is always imminently about to collapse. The thing you'll notice if you look at those channels is that those sorts of titles get lots of views. That incentivizes them to keep going for titles and thumbnails that dramatize that same concept to the absolute max. Even channels like, say, Paul Warburg, because Warburg is one of the best geopolitics channels. His commentary is always thoughtful and good value. I'm a huge fan. You will see that the algorithm has very much pushed him to titles and thumbnails that emphasize exactly this. Russia, vulnerable, in crisis, Ukraine, powerful. And look, it's working for him. His channel is growing at an insane speed right now, and I celebrate that because he works hard on producing great content. He deserves the success. But don't take it on face value. The truth is that Russia is under immense pressure, and Ukraine is under immense pressure, and China is under immense pressure. Any one of them could collapse. We saw it with the Soviet Union. Nobody really saw the speed and scale of that collapse coming in advance. But those sorts of dramatic moments are vanishingly rare. It's the easiest thing in the world to point at numerous factors. Oh, this is going wrong. This other thing is going wrong. Then there's this third thing that's going wrong. Put them all together and you get imminent total collapse. But that's not reliable, because it's focused only on one side of the balance sheet, and it's not reliable because usually it's disconnected from any sort of analysis of why systems actually collapse, why societies collapse. It's a much more complex phenomenon. In Russia's case, the main potential weakness for Putin is the idea of regime overthrow. If things seriously go wrong, a collapse would likely take the form of action against him. And that wouldn't mean that Russia stops fighting Ukraine. And it wouldn't be something we'd see coming until it's happening. All current reports are that he retains his tight grip. If all the other system failings that are present in Russia started to overwhelm the state, you could expect to get an indicator of that happening by Putin suddenly becoming much more interested in negotiating peace. Right now, his willingness to irritate the United States out of its apparent support for him can only be based on confidence in the current strategy. Now sure, such confidence, especially for a dictator, can often be misplaced. But I wouldn't trust anyone speaking with absolute confidence that they can predict Russian collapse right now. Mostly, they're feeding the algorithm. Okay, one old man on the road 0934. It looks a lot to me that Trump is populating ICE with believers, giving them permission to be his masked bully boys. This looks an awful lot like he's building his own private militia, loyal only to him. What are your thoughts on this? Yes, when I did my video about what it would take for actual fascism to take hold in the United States, I talked about the various factors and where the US currently was on a scale of 1 to 5 on those various factors. The one where the US was still furthest behind still on the starting blocks almost, is the routine use of political violence by the state. We've seen plenty of indications that there's an appetite for it at the starting level. But it's very hard to go straight into that when the mechanisms of the state have been, by tradition, wholly against that sort of misuse. Now, if Trump was a competent, deliberate-minded dictator, the creation of a private militia keen to do his bidding, glorying in the use of violence to the max, absolutely what he would do. Trump, however, is an incompetent, instinctual, would-be dictator who would happily see protesters roughed up. And he's certainly gleeful about seeing distant so-called narco-terrorists blown up, but hasn't yet crossed into the mental mindset of the use of lethal force against domestic opponents. And maybe he won't. It's the key dividing line between elective dictatorships such as Orban's Hungary and actual fascist regimes. The routine and strategic use of violence by the state against its internal political opponents and anyone else it takes against. Trump is not there. Possibly doesn't think himself that's where he's going. But you have to say that the building blocks he's putting in place, they certainly have a clear direction of travel. As various donors to left-wing and pro-democracy causes are fearing. It was reported today many of them are moving hundreds of millions of dollars of funds to the UK from the United States in fear of Trump's forthcoming attacks on them, which you have to say is something of a tell. All right, my thanks for the questions. If you want to ask something for this slot, top and tail your comment below with blue heart emojis so that they stand out from all the various other comments and I can easily see them. My thanks also to the Patreon supporters who make these videos possible. That's all for now. Have a great weekend.